it means, it has meaning by its very nature. And the satisfaction then of seeing this, which is both ordered and yet not oppressively ordered, is part of the joy that makes it something accessible to everybody. Let's look at the next, and makes people have that great sense that they wish they had it. And here's another, this is far more ordered. It is symmetrically created, for instance. Each side balances the other side. But by some, and nobody can tell you how really, by some kind of marvelous magic, it takes on a quality of light, and therefore something which is more flowing, something which is not as strictly confined in an order that is inviolable. And it's something which was made in Egypt right around 3000 BC. And it has pleased and delighted everybody who's ever seen it ever since. It is one of the balancing of, partly because of the variety of the color of the geese, and partly because of the fact that they are living things, and they take on this quality of life. Let's look at the next one. And sometimes a whole society, say a whole culture, will opt for a greater amount of actually chaos, or something which is not easily pointed out, than for order. And this is another thing which then limits the artist within that time, and limits us in our appreciation of it. But since the greatest works in any society, any culture, any kind of activity of man, mostly can be enjoyed by us as other members of the human race. And this, I showed you some of these things the last time. This is from India, and India has everything having to do with India has a kind of lavishness or richness or a prodigality of form, a prodigality of objects, and it's a sense of the gathering of everything having a marvelous kind of reciprocity and relationship, and that is just characteristic of the thought behind it, because any such culture, anything which we call a tradition, is made by ideas. It's made by the taste and values and ideas of people who maintain that tradition. And the tradition of India is one of richness, of visual richness, and elaboration to such a degree that many people really cannot stand Indian art. Because they fall into this sense of just such elaboration, such enormous variety and richness that they can't take it in. The same as the Baroque. The Baroque in Europe in the 17th century is to some people offensive because it is too elaborate, it is too rich. The people who like Swedish modern are not going to like it. I mean, that's all there is to it. And people who follow what is the great character of much of what we even recognize as modern is that it has no richness, that it aims against richness. It's a kind of effort for things not to be absorbing and rich, but completely cool and like this floor. This floor is just marvelous. Think of what somebody whose whole tradition made them make Oriental rugs would think if they were suddenly dropped down on this floor. They'd say, "What is this? What is this for?" People who used to make houses for chickens, more elaborate, more beautifully carved than they make for themselves at the present time. And the taste for something which is not ornamented, which is not rich, is very strong. And yet, you see, then some of the things like the elephant, anybody can enjoy as a perfectly clear object. And let's look at some of the slides, those closer things. There's the elephants with their family. This is a story. Now, this art, all art, actually requires some knowledge of what the story is, the story behind it, because there's always a story behind it. And this is the story of the descent of the Ganges, that in India was a terrible drought, and holy men prayed and prayed, and finally the Ganges came down from heaven. It was a holy river in heaven. They came down and watered the earth. And with it came all the things from heaven, the gods and goddesses and all of it, everything. You see, that whole sense of this richness, of the pouring out of richness of life, that simply floods over this actually what is just a cliff. They just carved this great story into the side of a cliff. And you can see the gods, the god and goddesses, male and females coming down over there on the right. They're floating down from heaven. And here's a man who's praying down here, or he's doing penance. He's putting his hands over his head, and he stands there until the gods will let the Ganges come down. And enough of them did that. And you find them, you see, all through this whole thing. Their shrines, sitting outside their shrines, meditating, standing there in attitudes of prayer, and then down comes the Ganges. Let's look at the next one, because it's got some of my favorite. Here are the various figures that come down, so a figure like a serpent and all kinds. So you see that really the whole sacred world and the whole physical world both come flooding down within the Ganges. Let's look at the next one. There's a man praying. And the next one, which is, now see, when you look at these separately, then you have no trouble. When you also know the story and look at them separately, the parts of them separately, there's no chaos to it. There's nothing which is too difficult for us. Instead, each part is clear. But this is something which you were meant to see hundreds of times. You're meant to see it so that it's in a way, it's inexhaustible, isn't it? And you have a choice. I can look at this thing, I can look at the next. Let's look at the next one, which is one of my absolute favorites. This is a cat doing penance for having caught all these mice. And their mice are all around her as disciples. It's a wonderful idea, you see, and what a joy it is to find it, in that whole great elaborate thing of all the gods and goddesses and all these animals and everything coming down. And there's this cat who's doing penance for having killed the mice or tortured them, and the mice having forgiven her and stand around thanking her, or worshiping her for doing that. Let's look at the next slide. And so it's that quality which is such a great, rich thing that's possible when something is going to be seen a long time, seen over a long period by a whole lot of people, all believing in the same thing. And so the images are strengthened, even if they are more, if there are more of them, and if they're way too rich for most people's powers, literally, to organize them. And that it's still, if they can be seen slowly, and if they can be seen with knowledge, there is marvelously rich and delightful thing. This is, again, part of another, actually 1,000 years before the things that I just showed you. But it has that whole sense of the interweaving of people with the natural world and with animals, very much a part of that, and plants and trees and flowers, so that the whole thing makes this a wonderful, rich stew of life that is as satisfying as you could ask, and which marks the whole imagination of India. And whether it's in stories, or whether it's in visual things, or whether it's in music, anyway, it always has this marvelous richness and a sense of something which is elaborate and almost inconceivably complex. And let's look at the next slide, because then you get a totally different civilization, like the Egyptian, you see, which couldn't be farther from that in terms of what they want to see. And the whole Egyptian world was absolutely intent on two things. One, that everything should continue to exist, that nothing needed to be destroyed, and that nothing needed to be changed. And the astonishing thing is that they were able to do that. Let's look at the next slide. We'll see. And everybody knows, when they see this, they know it's Egypt. They know, and it's the only place where this kind of thing, these pyramids ever were made. And they were made with, incredible difficulty. I mean, they're 400 feet high, the tallest one, and 450. And they're made of blocks that weigh as much as something like 40 tons. So the engineering of it's incredible, and the actuality of it's incredible, and it has stamped people's minds all the time, forever and a day, because if you ever see them, and you know that this was made by a human being, it just alters your idea of what a human being can do. And it did that for everybody that ever saw them. And then the extraordinary thing is that they had this great success because people, they were made almost 2,700 BC. That is nearly 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. And in that time, the people who made them, of course, long dead. The society, the actual structure of the society, radically changed everything. And people wanted to destroy the pyramids. They wanted, why? Because of this marvelous material, building material, sitting right there, all stacked up in pyramids that meant nothing to people by that time. And they couldn't do it. Nobody could do it in 3,000 years. Nobody can do it in 5,000 years. And I don't know whether we could blow them up or not. But after all, Napoleon's soldiers shot cannons at them and knocked off the nose of the Sphinx, but the pyramids stayed. You can't get a knife between the blocks of stone. They wanted something that would not change. And of course, everything in the world does change, you see. But they set themselves against it. The whole world, they limited themselves to make things which would not change. And they did this, of course, they did this about the body, exactly unlike our present. They invented the kind of mummification that meant that the body didn't change that much. If you see unwrapped mummies, they look pretty good for the age, and they're not, they're not dreadful-looking creatures at all. They just look a little sunburned and dried up a trifle, but that's not anything like what happens to most bodies very shortly after death. They were dead set against them. They limited their imagination to making things last and making them be unchanged. And in art, the whole aim was to make something which was exactly like what had been made before. And it was the only thing which they could accept. And they stayed in this peculiar, special style. Let's look at the next slide. That's the pyramids. The only thing that they did, they once had a limestone covering to make it dazzling white, and which it must have been just extraordinary to see. You could chip that off, and a lot of it's been chipped off, you see. But so nothing but the top, which is very hard to get at, is still there. But they took a form which is the most unshakable form in the world, which is the pyramid. There's nothing is going to knock it over. And it constitutes, as you look at it, you feel this marvelous, utter, total stability of the thing. And that's exactly what it had. Let's look at the next slide. And one of the things which they did to ensure this was to make as many of whatever they were making as they possibly could. And so you have columns of this happens to be the sphinxes. You have a mile of rounds, carved things around. Each one, of course, absolutely unique, but each one aiming to be as much like each other one as possible, so that there would be as little change as is possible. And it was a tremendous an extraordinary thing, you see, to be able to do that. Part of the reason that they could is because they were living in Egypt, and so even something made of wood would last. But that wasn't in their minds. What they wanted to do was to make everything last. And it had to do with their religion. There had to be a body for the soul to come to continue to live. It had to have a body, and the body had to be as much like the actual person as possible. And the whole thing is just all tied together. Let's look at the next one. And they didn't ever want anything really to change. And they managed not to have it change. So that and part of the effect of this is that a great many people know much more about Egypt without even ever trying to think about it than almost any other civilization. If I could ask almost anybody to make to be an Egyptian or to do an Egyptian dance, and everybody knows what they do. They have to turn their feet that way, and they have to turn their shoulders this way, and their heads that way, and then you feel quite Egyptian, and you are, you see, because it's a very clear idea, which is that you put everything in its most memorable width. So the way to remember the shoulders, we think of shoulders always as head on. We think of hips as side view and feet as side view. In fact, it's very difficult to draw feet from the front. You have to take quite a lot of skill to do it, or to draw shoulders from the side. But they didn't want that kind of change. They wanted them to look exactly like, and they do. This is from almost 3000 BC, and it's exactly the same kind of vision, the same desire that you'll have right when Rome conquers. So let's look at the next slide. When Rome conquers the world. See, here's that great familiar head view of the shoulders, head view of the eye. The eye is always seen as if you're looking at it right straight from the front. And so it's in a shape like that. And interestingly, if you ask people to draw this in the air in front of them, if I ask you to draw an eye, almost everyone makes that kind of shape. And if I ask you to draw shoulders, you do like that. This is a very fundamental kind of vision of the human body. Let's look at the next one. He's having a drink. And the gestures then are very limited. Let's look at the next with this, because they're at least 2,000 years apart. And the gesture is almost the same. The event is totally different. This is somebody killing his enemies, and let's look back at the other one. The other one is simply hunting. But the gesture is the same. Now it's the same for totally different situations, and it's the same over 2,000 years. So this is the achievement. This is a marvelous achievement of the very dream that the Egyptians had, that things should not change, that they should stay the same. Let's look at the next. So, just a marvelous thing. The next one. Yes, and then when they used the figure, they always used with as little bend or as little motion or as little asymmetry as possible. They were seen absolutely straight head on. And usually the only activity was 1 foot ahead of the other. The rest is completely as solid as the pyramids, as solid as the mummy, as solid as everything, and unchanging as everything that they ever made or wanted. Let's look at the next one. And this is that they needed to look like the people that they wanted because of the whole elaborate. The Egyptians, you see, were really more interested in death, which is they call their houses, they call them hotels. And they thought of their real house as a tomb. And that was the house of the dead, was really where they were going to live. And it's interesting to think because, you see, death does impose a kind of order and an unchanging quality, and that life can never have. It's like the difference between something which is very cold. The colder you get, the less the atoms do. The closer they are to actually to death, where their emotions. And scientists have never been able to reach that point, absolute zero, but it is still, as you approach it, there's an ordering and a slowing down and an unchanging quality, which is the opposite of life, which is the opposite of the ebullience and the jump and the vigor and the whole chaotic character of life. And yet they had to have images which looked like the people, because otherwise the same thing that we all feel, they wouldn't be happy in a body that really didn't look like them. It wasn't theirs. The ghost wouldn't be. So it was required for them to look like they did. And you know absolutely that this is a portrait. This is somebody, and he was just somebody that the Pharaoh needed in the afterlife, because he needed all the servants that he needed in what thought of as his hotel. And he needed all people to work and everything else, you see, because death was the unchanging reality of life. Let's look at the next one. 2,000 years between those last two. No need for change. No real need for change. Let's look at the next one. Now that's a slave. Here's another, see. It's the same position as the arms can do very little. They can either be down to the side or one can be across. And otherwise, there's nothing they can do in the piece of sculpture. Because, of course, that way they're not going to break off. The thought of their being broken, you see, an arm out here is going to break off in terms of a piece of sculpture. But here it won't. And so that they hold on to those things which reinforce this quality of timelessness. Let's look at the next one, and of something which cannot be destroyed. It will be the same. And this is one of the goddesses, lion-headed goddess. And the next one, 2,000 years between them. And they were able to prevent any kind of exterior change. The quality of the interior changes because they get more and more formalized and less having the quality of an actual person. Let's look at the next one. It was but the society itself was so different from everything that we know about it. We know a lot about it because they wrote down everything all the time, kept careful records. But there's a kind of a California quality to it, maybe partly because of the climate. It was a gracious climate for them, and they had beautiful houses which were made of stuff that never lasted. They were made deliberately not to last. And they had a great sense of clothes and of a kind of sleek urban quality. And I think this lady would be a perfect example of that same persistent quality if she appeared to us right now. Let's look at the next one out of it. This is, again, this delights me because it was one of the things that the Egyptians did that I've always thought ought to be some way brought into our own society, that they made little forms out of beeswax and filled them with perfume and put them on the top of their heads. And so the hotter it got, the sweeter you smelled. And you would find you would just be walking around on a hot day in a perfect cloud of delicious smell. Well, you see, that's a very, when you know that about them, you know they've got a lot of things having to do with the joy of the world and the joy in the physical, and a way of managing. They also could make linen, so fine it was finer than silk. They could make all kinds of things like that, paper and so on. Let's look at that. This is a picture of them from about 2000, 1500 BC. This is women gathering lilies to make perfume. And so that was an important part of the work, was to make perfumes, to make all the very great varieties of food and a whole sort of sumptuous physical life that was seems in such contrast to that desire for things not to change, because it does allow for that kind of life requires change. It requires a change in what is being done and also in the way things are done. Let's look at the next slide. Here's one of my favorites, because they always had great numbers of dancing girls. They had exactly as they still do, you know. I mean, though there are different people living there and it's a different world entirely, but the sense of dancing, of the individual dancing, and a dance which is almost like an acrobatic thing, but which is nonetheless very, very, very beautiful use of the body. And there are great numbers of pictures of dancing girls, and they're all in this strange constriction of how they can move. I mean, they can't take their feet off of the ground very easily, and they can't twist or burn or turn their bodies. But for that kind of frontality here, they give a great sense of the delight that the Egyptians had. Let's look at the next in those things. I want to show you a few things from China, just because it is one of the most ancient of all of the great civilizations. It had one of the strongest traditions that ever existed. Its tradition it wasn't because they intended, as Egypt did, they didn't have that same sense of the necessity of the preservation of everything and the duplication of everything, therefore. But instead, they believed that they had found what was the right vision, the thing which balances, say, chaos and order, the thing which conveys what the nature of the world is, and they held on to it, and they felt no need to change it. It undergoes changes, but nothing which is really too profound, and nothing which really ignores what was achieved. This is before, this is what is really prehistoric. It's probably at least 3000 BC, maybe more than that. And the quality is an absolutely Chinese quality. One of the things which the Chinese ceramics supremely did was to make a very small foot for any kind of a ceramic dish. And it gives to them a wonderful kind of lightness. You see this, you feel almost as though this is going to rise up off of the earth. It's exactly the opposite of a pyramid. It's totally the opposite. Where the whole sense of movement upward and movement that is really like a bubble or like a balloon or something. It has great air and lightness in it. Is an extraordinary achievement, you know, because mostly this very early ceramic things are fairly heavy and hold themselves to the ground. But this is just seems to be almost spinning with, as if it were moving away. Let's look at the next one. And there's one, actually, Sung period, 13th century of our era. So at least 3,000, 4,000 years between them. And it's not because they knew those things. That thing that you just saw, the ceramic that you just saw, wasn't excavated until recently. It's simply that this need was inherent in the whole nature of that culture, that society, that civilization, and what we call that tradition, because it is a very clear and powerful tradition. And it's one which, let's look at the next slide, has something, and here's again, these are again, two which are as far apart in time almost as you can get. This one very ancient, early, and the next one, not because they see them. but because this is what is part of what they believe and hold to. Let's look at the next thing. One of the things which the Chinese imagination can do, and that this goes all through their whole tradition, is that they give a kind of extraordinary life to things which don't have life. That is, that are not living things. And if you look at this one and the next one, and imagine them, I mean, you can't help feeling that they have a personality or a life. Let's look back at the other one. And now those two, you know, would have a lot to disagree about. This one is so, oh no, he's so absolutely self-satisfied, solid, and it's got all of his weapons ready. And the other one is a mocker. Let's look at him again. It's just, they have such, I don't know, such a marvelous sense of their own reality as living beings, and it's not by imitating the appearance of anything at all. It's simply that they have, and it comes to the basic Chinese conviction that the whole universe is created and maintained by the union of opposites, and that all life has this quality, and that the yang and the yin, or the power of the female form and the power of the male form, are the sun, as a yin, as a yang thing, as a male image, creates the earth, and but couldn't unless that were also female. So that it's a continuous sense of the union of opposites that gives tension and a kind of excitement and a sense also of personal actuality. Let's look at the next one. The pleasure, the joy in this kind of elaboration of materials that make for silk, standing at one of the great bases of the society, and the patterns and the making of them staying wonderfully constant, but not constant in the same sense that the Egyptians were, but instead they just seem, and almost anyone who showed this to would think, well, that's Chinese, even if they didn't know anything about it. Or they would at least say, well, it's Oriental. The stamp of that quality is still on this thing, which is a banner from about 200 AD. Let's look at the next one. There's a detail of it. Let's look at the next. And here's this wonderful discovery of just a few years ago of the tomb of one of the great emperors. And at a time when China was in exactly, really almost exactly the same kind of condition that Rome was in. It was an empire, and it was very conscious and had a great variety of people living there, and a very strong sense of the actual appearance of things. That is, this is a tomb of just, you can't even imagine what a great number of horses and their guardians, their grooms, and soldiers, and everything that the emperor would need in his future life. And he took with him in the form of these horses and people and soldiers. Let's look at them close up, because each one is seen absolutely individually. Each one, when he has a horse with him, it is his horse. It is the horse that he has been given to take care of all of his life and all of the horse's life. And his actual faces, let's look at them, because they're so extraordinary. You're immediately, let's look at the next two, immediately brought into absolute contact with this figure, this, you know that this is what this person actually looked like this. And there's not anything perfunctory, there's not anything which is so stylized that you don't think of it as actual individuals. And there's thousands of them. Thousands of them. Let's look at the next one. They're all in their costume, their armor. And that taste continues right on through. There's always a taste for what we would think of as a realistic portrait in Chinese art. And some of the very great ones, and one of the greatest periods, the Tang period, of the horses and of the warriors, that follow exactly this. And of course, this was not even, no one had ever seen at that time. Let's look at the next. And then, of course, one of the great civilizations, one of the great traditions, is the tradition of Greece. And it's exactly the opposite of what I've been saying, because it is the shortest moment, it is the shortest tradition in terms of actual time. The achievement of what it was takes maybe 200 years, but what it was lasts only 50. And then it begins to change and alter. It's exactly the opposite, you see, of Egypt and of China and of India, because it has a very brief moment of achieving, and then it diffuses itself and changes and becomes another kind of thing, holding on only to certain qualities. And one of the qualities is the attention to man. And remember the idea that man is the measure of all things. And so when these columns, as I told you, when they're made from the point of view of two things. One of mathematics and one of the eyes of the person looking at it. So that sense of man measuring whatever exists and whatever is to be seen is the core of the Greek vision, of the Greek tradition. And it is the only society that I know anything about, I think, that there's ever been, where the gods are really human beings, only larger. More human being than they would be otherwise. And they embrace all divinity, all Godhead, by the vastness of how they are human beings, by the power of their enormous emotions, by their terrible desires, by their whole, their need for order, their need for love, their need for every kind of human experience. They have them, and they exult in them. And there are no monsters. There's no need, in the Greek imagination, there's no need for the gods to be part animal. Almost every other has either been that they are part animal or that they are so, like the great Indian images of the divinity, which have 3 heads and 6 arms and so on. That would have been offensive to the Greeks, because it was a conviction of the extraordinariness of the human being, the absolute the aspect of divine of the human being. And the columns are really like figures standing there. They have a human life. Let's look at the next one. And of course, when the image which they used was a standing nude male figure. And in the 6th century BC, they were working on it. They were trying to make it more. You see, they were not satisfied with that kind of rigidity that meant everything to the Egyptians. They wanted something to have instead a greater ease, a greater openness and ease of manner. And they worked on it. They did not work on it by, let's look at the next slide, by looking at models. They worked on it by thinking about it and by imagining what is the ideal human being. What is that ideal that we never will see, but the artist can make visible. And you see how much farther he's gone. By this time, though, it's only about 20 years difference. And they wanted them to be agreeable, and so they made this very strange smile, because if they didn't look agreeable, they would look pretty gloomy. And so they have this exaggeration, but they also are filled with a perfect, extraordinary energy. You feel as something is trying to get out. Something is trying to break this kind of form, to move beyond it. Let's look at the next one, which of course they do. And in the period between 460 and 450 BC, they were able to achieve this in a perfectly extraordinary way that immediately when any other human beings ever see it, or they're just intoxicated by it. It is an ideal. It's not like somebody that ever existed. It's not, I mean, it's like everybody that ever did exist. And it's this kind of achievement that just no other society ever was able to make to the same degree. This is Poseidon, Zeus. This is it's only fairly recently been recovered. Let's look at the next slide. I have several images of him to get some sense of the very thing which they believe, that in the human being, in particular, of course, in the man, unadorned, no clothes, no ornamentation, no tattooing, no nothing, you see. Just this is what he is. And what he is so extraordinary, so powerful, so surging with energy, and with a sense of that energy under order, control, that it immediately captivates people's imagination. Let's look at the next one after that. So that they were able to make the human beings out of their gods, or gods into their human beings, in a way that was really, first of all, lasted only a short time. By another 40 years from the time this would be made, the end of the 5th century, it would all go. It would all be gone, every bit of it. Let's look at the next one. They once had eyes that were set in, which would be very startling to us, but which were part of that feeling of liveliness that goes through all the whole rest of the body. Let's look at the next one. There's a softening now, but then look at the very next one. And you see, this is a short time afterwards. This is a relatively short time, that is less than a couple of generations. And everything that other one was is gone. The only thing that remains is that it's the same subject matter. It's a standing nude male figure. But now it's supposed to be Apollo, and he's supposed to be looking at a lizard. Well, you know, that's not a very exalted action for Apollo. And he himself has become very soft and very powerless, actually, increasingly powerful. Let's look at the next one. And that goes even farther. He becomes simply, with no vitality, no really inner vitality. This is the Apollo Belvedere, which is a late image with of course, that ornamentation on his genitals is late. Let's look at the next one. I have a head, one from the 4th century. And it's one of the few things that's left. You see, one of the amazing things, again, exactly the opposite of Egypt, there's almost nothing left. There's not one single painting left. And the painting and artists of the painters were highly admired and made legends of themselves. Legends continue to live, but we have absolutely no idea what they think looks like. And the same thing is true of sculptors, right? They're great sculptors. We know the names of them. We know the Roman imitations of them. We know all kinds of things, but the thing itself we don't. And yet the power that is still in the things which are even removed, you see, which are far away from it. That power was so great that it can't be totally destroyed. And you get this much softer head of the 4th century. One of the most beautiful, certainly, one of the most extraordinary, and also, of course, one of the most tremendously influential. It's where these appeared despite everything. They moved people. Let's look at the next time. Moved them often to imitation, but never to any kind of possible similar achievement. And the standing draped female figure goes through the same kind of change. From the 6th century, when she's still quite contained, or she's quite strictly confined, until she could move. Let's look at the next one. She can move easily, and where she begins to be half nude. And by the end of Greece, the nude female figures usually was scandalous. When this particular piece of sculpture was sent to Milos, the people sent it back because they said that this is a terrible thing to show a woman without her clothes on, because the whole tradition was of the standing female draped figure. And then, of course, that is lost. Then we begin to have entirely new. Let's look at the next slide. But the draped figure still has the quality that it had at its very beginning. It still has a kind of gracefulness, a kind of beauty. It's a thing which amplifies and augments the quality of femaleness. And this Nike fixing her sandal that I showed you last time, that has this wonderful union of what is ordinary and what is extraordinary, not only extraordinary but actually invisible if we didn't see this. Let's look at the next one. And the victory, you see, everybody knows this. And everybody has a kind of an inevitable response to it. That is, it has that quality of something which has never been seen, never will be seen. But now we see it. And so we can lose ourselves in this marvelous winged figure, and with a whole sense of her striding, a whole sense of her power in her physical body, and in the power that she has, that we can share. When we look at it, we just inevitably feel that. We feel ourselves to be strong, and we feel ourselves to be able to fly, to grant victory. Let's look at the next slide. Now, our own tradition. And see, when I say tradition, for many people this is a very disagreeable idea, but actually the great thing about a tradition is that it allows an enormous number of people to make things which are at a high level, because the tradition sustains them. And this one happens even with a style. If a style becomes very strong, it's something which many, many people can do. I mean, actually almost anybody can do, because once it's clear what you should do, then it's easy to do it. And the tradition tells you what you should do. And our tradition from the time of the Renaissance on, which is the one that now is collapsing around us, is a tradition in which there's great faith in the individual, there's great interest in the individual, there is a belief that we stand on real ground with real air around us and a real relationship to trees and to buildings and everything else. And this was painted before 1429, that is in the first quarter of the 15th century. And nobody can account for how this man, whose name is Masaccio, was able to get this vision, which then lasts for 500 years. And there's nowhere that it comes from. And the whole of the Renaissance, everybody, all the artists of the Renaissance went and tried to copy Masaccio's work and spent all their time copying it because they didn't see how you could do this, how you could make the air seem to be around people, how you could make the sense of distance, how you could make perspective, which is a very highly individual thing, you see, which you believe you create the world in your own vision from where it is. You know that with that great thing about the parallel lines that don't meet anywhere, but when we look at a railroad track, it looks as though they meet. They come toward each other. They don't do it. But that illusion of created by our own eyes, by an individual standing here, looking there, is what creates perspective. And it is not a vision which is common to a great many peoples. In fact, it is almost uncommon for all peoples, except people under the influence of the Renaissance. Other ways of making depth, putting something in front of something, or making it smaller in the distance, all these things people have used. But that kind of perspective, which depends on a person standing here and looking there, and having an orderly regression until things seem actually to meet as they're parallel, is part of ours, and which is, of course, under severe attack at the present time. So, and to be able to see forms in light and shadow. For 2,000 years, there were no shadows. Nobody had a shadow. When in paintings, they didn't have shadows. Now, it's the most conspicuous thing in the world, but it was not used because it was not interesting to people. It was not something which they cared about. And Masaccio sees that we have shadows, and sees that part can be in the light and part can be in the shade, and that this defines the form. Well, this is an extraordinary idea, you know. And it's an amazing thing, and it's absolutely inexplicable because he died when he was 26 years old. That much we know. But you see, what a thing. His vision transformed the vision of people from that. And we wouldn't have the kind of cameras that we have if it hadn't been for Masaccio or something just like Masaccio. Because they're based on exactly this vision from one person looking out. And that is still, it still seems to us to be reality when we see it. Let's look at the next one. And of course, all of the amplifications on that, all the movements on that began in the 15th and 16th century in Italy, that we call the Renaissance, which looked back to Greece and Rome, more to Rome than to Greece, but saw human beings as existing in a world which was suitable to them, that is, which matched them. It wasn't something like a gold background, which meant that all of the things, the trees and everything else, are really only illusion. It was a world that had the kind of density of the reality of things and the reality of people in those situations and in that world with those things. A reality which was substantial, which was the body, which was the mind, which was the whole being, but conceived in this way. And of course, that is exactly what we are in the present time losing. And it's a difficult and a painful thing because nothing else has appeared to explain us. Nothing else that we can make has the same power to explain, but that still has to explain. And we may have to wait a long time because once a tradition collapses, it falls into chaos. And for something else to happen, a new idea has to occur. And then the new vision of that idea will occur. Because that's what we do. We make things real. We make the world of heaven and hell. We make all things visible and invisible to eliminate our own limitation. Thank you very much.